Good day and welcome to the Remote Experience for Young Engineers and Scientists program known as REYES. My name is Giovanna Gennard, co-founder and co-chair of REYES, and I will serve as your host for today's lecture, Fake Science, featuring Eric Swanson. Today's discussion offers us insight into pseudoscience, why it is dangerous, and how to detect it. Throughout this webcast, you may submit questions through the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. And following Dr. Swanson's lecture, we will answer as many of your questions as time allows. It is now my pleasure to introduce our guest speaker. Eric Swanson is professor of physics at the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. He explores how quarks and gluons build the universe, especially how they form unusual combinations called exotics. His research focuses on describing the structure and interaction of hadrons, those particles which are made of quarks and gluons. He's especially interested in exotics, particles made in whole or in part by gluons. Some of his research involves using a numerical method called lattice gauge theory to probe different aspects of the QCD vacuum. He's part of an active global effort to discover these particles, including serving as a member of an experimental effort at Jefferson Lab in Virginia called GlueX. Dr. Swanson is a fellow of the American Physical Society, and you may remember that Dr. Eric Swanson presented the particle explosion at REYES in June, and we're delighted to welcome him back today. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Swanson.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for the introduction. Very nice.
Thank you.
So today I'm going to talk to you about fake science. And I want to convince you that it is something you need to pay attention to and give you some tips on how to find it. I'll give you lots of examples of this stuff as we go. So I'll just start off here. I'll share my screen and we'll go. All right, so there's the title, Fake Science. Here's a definition. Fake science or pseudoscience, something that appears to be scientific but is not. And this comes from the dictionary as Swansonicus. In other words, I just invented this definition. I'm not sure if there's an official definition, but this is good enough for us. All right, so I want to give you an example of this from a TV show. So we'll play this video. Hopefully you'll be able to hear it.
What you're thinking, well, hold on, if that happens, where am I going to get all my interesting bullshit from? Don't worry, we have you covered.
Do you love science and all its complexity, but wish it could be a little less complex and a lot less scientific? Introducing Todd Talks, where the format of TED Talks meets the intellectual rigor of morning news shows.
Chocolate. It will kill you. What if I were to tell you all that the cure to racism is coffee?
And in my research, I found out red wine makes babies 20% more sociable. That's a baby we can work with.
Okay, I think I'll pause it there, but you get the idea. These people are the comedians are making fun of sort of outlandish statements that you hear, and actually you hear this stuff a lot, and I'll show it to you as we go. So let me give you some examples. There are lots of different kinds of this. Conspiracy theories fit into this, the general idea as well. So here's a famous one. Is Bill Gates implanting us with 5G microchips in the COVID vaccine? Sometimes it's just straight up bad science. Here's one from National Geographic. Millions of fewer girls born due to nuclear radiation, ? Or bad reporting. Times of London. Cocaine floods the playground. This is a famous example I like to poke fun at. And sometimes it's very simple. People just want your money. So here's a bracelet. It's got copper in it. It's magnetic, and it has the word Jesus stamped on it. So it's supposed to make you feel better somehow. First question then, how common is this? How common is it that these, pseudoscientific ideas, we come across these things? Well, I get in my newsfeed, I get a handful of these every day. So all the time, a continuous stream of pseudoscientific claims. And here's just a little random example I've taken over the years. The mystery of magnetic cows. Ants lead the way in earthquake prediction. Will this phone kill you? New electricity meter stirs fears. religious affiliation and brain shrinkage, evidence suggests humans can sense the future, and microwave weapons are a prime suspect in ills of the US embassy workers. Now, this stuff isn't, written in comic books and so on. These are prestigious news organizations that are presenting this stuff to the public, all of these things. Let's look at a different way to think how common this is, how much money is spent on these things. So if I look at some of this, there is a fair amount of evidence that a lot of what people do with vitamins is just worthless. And $23 billion a year, roughly speaking, is spent on vitamins every year in the United States. $34 billion a year is spent on alternative medicine. A lot of the diet industry doesn't really do anything at all, and $46 billion a year is spent on diet industry. Even therapeutic magnets, $500 million a year, which is just remarkable that people think just putting a magnet next to you will cure some problem that you have. Here's another little chart showing some of this. Homeopathic medicine, about $3 billion a year spent on this. Chiropractic, about $4 billion a year. Massage, you could argue that's actually worthwhile, so maybe let's not count that. But about $15 billion a year is spent on natural products, which people think help them in some way or another. What about people's opinions? Let's look at that. So here was a poll that was done a few years ago. Let's look at some of these things. There is no evidence vaccinations cause autism. Only 51% of people believe that this is true. And 49% of people are unsure or think that it's not true. Humans landed on the moon in the late 60s and 70s. 72% of people think that that's true, but that leaves 28% of people who aren't quite sure about that. So there's a lot of, odd beliefs out there. Here's another one. COVID-19 was created in a lab in China. 40% of people think that's incorrect. Honestly, most people should be in this gray category where you're not sure because you don't know. You don't know. You didn't work in the lab. You're not assessing the evidence. You should probably say you're not sure, if at all. So there's a lot of, strange beliefs out there. Here's a Gallup poll from about 20 years ago. 3 in 4 Americans believe in the paranormal. And you see here the breakdown of that. Fully 21% of people believe in witches. 25% believe in astrology. 41% believe in extrasensory perception. So this is kind of an alarming situation that we find ourselves in. The last thing that I mentioned here in terms of stats is we go back to this COVID vaccine problem. They did a poll and they found that 28% of people believe that, and 44% of Republicans in the United States actually believe that microchips are somehow getting into us from these COVID vaccinations. Now, it's not all bad news. Sometimes there's pushback. So here's some other collection of random articles I collected over the years where, there's pushback on this stuff. No decline in sperm count after all, Danish study shows. Nuclear power plant is cleared of the leukemia link. New analysis debunks connection between gum disease and heart attack. Doubt cast on the good and good cholesterol. Fish oil, omega-3s may not protect your brain health after all. Stop trashing eggs, large study finds no harm. Is PMS a myth? Colon cleansing benefits debunked. And back to that Cuban diplomats, doubts rise about evidence that US diplomats were attacked. So there's this back and forth, and it naturally arises, well, what should you believe? Are eggs good or are eggs bad for you? Were people attacked in Cuba or not? And sometimes it's important. Sometimes personal decisions will be made based on the information you're hearing. How do you assess it? So now I want to address this question. Why is this common? There's a lot of it. You can believe me on that. Why is it common? And I think it's a complicated answer, and it depends on a lot of things that come together. And I try to show them in this little chart here. So what I'm interested to hear is belief generation, which is, why do you believe what you believe? So for example, I believe that a certain woman who lives a couple hundred miles that way is my mother. Well, why do I believe she's my mother? She told me she's my mother, but do I have actual evidence that she's my mother? I have some circumstantial evidence, but I certainly don't have evidence at the level of, say, DNA proof. but nevertheless, I'm pretty sure she's my mother. What led me to believe that? So this chart is meant to indicate this, the process of the generation of belief. So it's got to start somewhere. An idea needs to start somewhere. And I call that an authority figure. It could be a scientist, a government official, a politician, anybody like that who comes up with an original idea. Then that, you'll never hear about that idea unless it's amplified somehow, usually through the media. So there's a stage where the idea gets amplified and usually gets distorted. So the media is mostly good at reporting science, but can sometimes blow it. And so you get this distorted version of the original idea. So it'll come through your cell phone or through television or magazines or whatever. And then it gets to the most complicated part, which is you. How do you deal with this new information that comes in? And how you deal with it depends a lot about your history, your social network, your political beliefs, your religious beliefs, and your education level. There is this idea, by the way, that education level is the sort of final arbitrator of whether you believe such and such a scientific claim or not, but it really is the least important thing. There's lots of feedback that goes on in this. So if you keep hearing the same thing over and over again because your social network is small, for instance, you'll believe it more. So there's this feedback. If you have a certain social network and a certain, say, political belief, you'll tend to choose where your information comes from. And that'll also enhance the things that you believe, perhaps not correctly. So I want to dig down into these three aspects a little bit more. The origination, the amplification, and the feedback. So we'll start with this idea here. This quite often can start from science itself. And science, as you likely know, is a very resilient thing. It's self-correcting. It's why science is a special thing. You can check what people claim, and you can check just using nature. Nature itself tells you whether an idea is right or wrong. But it turns out it's also fragile. And this is something that isn't taught in, say, grade schools and middle schools. So this part is taught. We teach people about making hypotheses and hypothesis testing, but you don't really learn about how fragile it is. So I want to get into that. First of all, some evidence that it is. This is an article from 13 years ago. And look down here, 80% of non-randomized studies turn out to be wrong. 25% of gold standard randomized studies do as well. And 10% of very good quality studies turn out to be wrong. This is alarming. This is the kind of information that comes to you, salt is bad for you, fish oils are good for you, all that kind of stuff that you make decisions that affect you. And it's quite possible that that particular study you're looking at is wrong. So this was actually a study of studies that this article is based on. And this very large number of studies turn out to be wrong when they drill down into this and look at what's going on. Here's an example of how studies can go wrong. So say that someone comes to you with a claim. So here's this claim. This person's running up and says, jelly beans cause acne. And they decide to investigate whether jelly beans cause acne or not. And they're doing it at a certain level of confidence. That's what this little number here means, p greater than 0.05. That means there's only a 5% chance of observing the thing that you observed. So they want to test the idea that jelly beans cause acne. And the scientists do it and they say, no, it doesn't, that jelly beans don't cause acne. And the stick figure says, well, hang on, I heard it's only a certain color of jelly beans that causes acne. So you can't read all this, but let me tell you that in each one of these panels, they're checking a different color. And you'll see that there are 20 of these panels here. And none of them cause acne, except for this one, green. Green seems to cause acne. And that person says, whoa. And then the big headline news, green jelly beans linked to acne, 95% confident. Now, you might start to glom on to the problem here. You're only working with 5% accuracy. You can only be certain about what you're saying at the 5% level. And they tested 20 things. One of those is 5%. So the odds are that you'll see something. This is called the look elsewhere effect. The idea is that if your vision's a little bit blurry and you keep looking long and hard enough and constantly, repeatedly, you'll eventually see something. And this happens all the time in science, and it leads to false observations, false claims that are made. I can give you lots of examples where this really happens. Here's another reason that science itself is kind of fragile. So I want you to look at this collection of little squares over here on the left. Each one of these squares represents a possible truth, okay, an idea, a possible thing in this weird, tiny little universe. So in this weird, tiny little universe, there are only 1,000 possible things. Now, of those 1,000 things, 100 of them, indicated in green up here, are true. Now, your job as a scientist in this weird little universe is to find out the true things. So you do it by doing a whole bunch of experiments. Now, remember, these experiments, they are not perfect, so they have a certain probability of giving you a false positive. You think you see something that isn't really there, or a false negative. Something is there, but you actually miss it. And these are indicated in these colors down here. The red are false negatives, and the blacks are false positives. Now, remember, the odds of getting a false positive are pretty small, but there are a lot of things that aren't true. And that means you get a fairly big number of things that you think are true that aren't. So you finish doing all your experiments, you end up in this world over here where you think all these things are true. You've missed some things that really are true, and you get a lot of things that actually aren't true. And in fact, with these numbers, which are not unrealistic, 36% of the things that you think are true actually aren't true. Now, in the real world, there's an infinity of possible things that are wrong, right? And so there's pretty good odds of getting a false positive. And the upshot is just like the point I was making a moment ago. If you're trying to find something that's rare with an instrument, an experiment, your eyes or whatever, that's kind of blunt, you'll get lots of false sightings. And this is one of the reasons that actually doing good science is difficult. It's not so easy to do. Okay, let's go on to the second stage through the media. I don't have a lot of time on this, but there are countless examples. I'll go back to the one I mentioned from this very prestigious newspaper that reported that cocaine is flooding the playground. The actual story there was that the government scientists were monitoring the use of drugs in elementary schools in London by questioning students how often they've used, tobacco or liquor or cocaine. And the figure from one year went from 1.4% to 1.6%. And the scientists rounded those numbers from down to 1% in the first year and 2% in the second year. And the reporter saw this and said, oh, went from 1% to 2%, its use has doubled. That's the use of the addictive drug by children doubles in a year. Of course, what was really happening is that there are just these sort of random fluctuations in these small numbers, and there's nothing really observable at all in this. Okay, on to this last bit, and that is how we as people come into this. How do we interpret the information that we are receiving? So there is lots of evidence out there that the way you receive information depends a lot about you. So here's an example here. So this is what I say, people filter information according to their biases and their influences. So this question here is the Earth warming? Is climate change real, for instance? And it's split up in these columns between people who are of the left political persuasion, Democrats in the United States, and people of the right political persuasion, Republicans in the United States. And you see that 84% of Democrats believe that the Earth is warming, but about half that number of Republicans believe that the Earth is warming. Now, they're presented with the same information. So obviously something is influencing these people to go up and these people to go down. So your politics, in other words, is influencing what you actually believe. And of course, your politics is really your peer group. So your peer group is influencing what you choose to believe. Ultimately, it comes down to a choice, right? Do you believe this or not? Here's another example that shows a different effect. This is a poll asking about whether you think that the coronavirus was intentionally planned by powerful people. So this is a conspiracy theory that some secret group of people out there created the coronavirus and released it onto the world. And here you see people agreeing with this, either definitely true or probably true. And let's just go down the left side here. This is broken down by education. So you see that as the people who are polled become more educated, their likelihood to believe this goes down dramatically. So there's a strong correlation of your education level with whether you believe this or not. There is some difference between conservatives and liberals here, not as big as with education. There is some correlation with race, but again, not as big as with education. And even between the sexes, males and females have a little bit of difference, not much difference depending on how old you are. So this is an example where education level has a large influence on whether you believe a certain claim that's out there or not. I should stress that there are lots of examples where education level is not associated with that. So the climate change one I just showed you, it's not really correlated with education level. Belief that vaccines cause autism is not correlated with education level either. Highly educated people believe that vaccines actually cause autism, even though there's no evidence for this at all. Okay, so it's prevalent, it matters, and who you are, what you experience, how you come across this information makes a difference on whether you believe it or not. And now I want to address this question, what can you do? What can you do about all of this? So one thing to be aware of is sort of nonsensical arguments that people make. And here are two common ones that I hear all the time. Quantum physics is indeterminate, therefore anything is possible. So this one particularly bothers me because I work in quantum physics. It's a theory, it's very well defined, it lets me make predictions about the universe. There's nothing particularly weird about it. But out there in the common world, what most people hear about quantum mechanics is that it's weird and spooky. And because of that weirdness, they think, well, anything can go on, which just isn't true. And here's another common one. Science doesn't know everything, which is true. Science certainly doesn't know everything. And therefore, basically anything you say is possible. So this is not a very good argument. Just because science doesn't know everything doesn't mean that it knows nothing. And in fact, a lot is known about science. So if you claim that you can generate energy with a machine and that the machine can run forever, science tells us, even though it doesn't know everything, that machine can't exist. It violates the laws of science as we know, even though we don't know everything. Pseudoscience itself is not science. And because of that, it doesn't have these famous qualities of science. Namely, it's not self-correcting. And because it's not self-correcting, what pseudoscience believes or pseudoscientific claims can change depending on where you are and when you are. And here I have some examples here that you probably are not familiar with at all. These were popular pseudoscientific claims when I was a teenager. So there was this idea called biorhythms that everyone had ups and downs in their emotions, their physical capabilities, and their intellectual capabilities. And they used to publish this in the newspapers. And the idea was that you would look and you'd want to see when all of these things were high, because then you'd have a really good day. But if lots of them were low, you were going to have a bad day. These other examples up here, this is a pyramid. So people believe that pyramids gave you special powers. Some people used to carry around little pyramids, little fake pyramids, and they thought it would channel energy and give them power. And part of that was due to that idea was due to this famous book called Chariots of the Gods, where this particular person argued that the pyramids were so complicated that they must have been built by aliens. Humans couldn't possibly have done it. And this last example over here was something that was very popular. Well, it was around 40 to 50 years ago, this idea of Dianetics. And you just don't hear of any of these things anymore. They've died out. They've died out because they're not science. They don't self-correct. They don't, you don't keep seeing evidence that affirms these things, and they just go away. And new things take their place. Okay, so the same thing happens with place. As I travel around the world, I'll hear different pseudoscientific beliefs depending on where I am. So, for example, if I'm in Italy, people will tell me that Italian coffee is really good for your health, much better than American coffee. And I'm just like, really? The coffee's that different? And, it's not a very damaging one, but it's a pseudoscientific belief that is held in Italy, but not anywhere else. And you'll see all sorts of examples of that as you go through life. So what can you do? Continuing this. So one of the things that would be very useful is to recognize the signs that you're dealing with pseudoscience. So one of the very obvious ones is that if it violates the laws of physics. So the problem with applying this is that you should know the laws of physics. So for instance, energy doesn't come for free. Energy is conserved is one of the laws of physics, and we've never seen that violated. And if someone makes a claim that violates a law like that, then you're sure that it's pseudoscience. And the example I have here is perpetual motion machines, this idea that you can build a device that just runs forever just by being sufficiently clever. That violates the laws of physics. Excessive and baffling jargon. If some people try to baffle you with fancy words and you're not really sure what it means and they're coming rapidly at you, you should feel a little bit suspicious. It should be possible to explain almost anything in simple language. And if people kind of refuse to do that, they keep throwing jargon at you, you should be a little bit suspicious. Results presented directly to the media. So when people have these sort of extravagant claims, they tend to go, if they're charlatans, they tend to go straight to the media and say, hey, I discovered an anti-gravity machine. And of course, the media is very interested in this. The usual way science is done is that you work very hard for many decades, you make some discovery, and you write a paper. That paper gets reviewed by peers, it gets published in a journal, and if it's really good, then it goes to the media. If you bypass all of that, you're basically bypassing the process of doing science, and it's a sign that pseudoscience is happening. Symptoms of crackpottery. So this is a word I made up again in that dictionary. By what I mean by that is that people are a little bit conspiratorial. They're worried. They are out to get me. They don't believe in my anti-gravity machine because the establishment doesn't want me to make an anti-gravity machine because they want to continue to make cars or something like that. And by the way, I run into this a lot. You see people saying, well, you don't believe this because you're one of them and you're out to get me, instead of you don't believe this because it's wrong. A lack of scientific consensus. So this is, again, hard to assess. How do you know what the science establishment believes as a whole? So you'll see statements in the newspaper all the time that 98% of climate scientists believe that climate science is true. Now, I actually don't know where they came up with that figure of 98%. It might have just been made up by some journalist at some point. But I'm pretty sure that most climate scientists believe that climate change is real. And so because of that, because I trust these scientists, they have no agenda, except other than to save the planet. They're certainly not making money out of it, good money anyway. I tend to believe them. Okay, so you have to assess who's telling you and try to assess their qualifications, try to assess if they're a minority figure, if they're just sort of ranting away about, oh, it's all wrong and we don't understand how thermometers work or something like that. Okay, or if they're part of the consensus. Another example of this is what I call shoddy studies. So I gave you lots of examples in the first part of this lecture of shoddy studies. They were all done by scientists. This claim that ants can detect earthquakes was a study made by real scientists. And you got to think that the person is doing their best. And something went wrong. And it's typically this kind of stuff. Small sample size means that you didn't ask enough people or study enough ants or look at enough cases. Biases are important. You would really, as a scientist, you would really like to make a big discovery, like ants can predict earthquakes. And so you tend to make errors that lead you towards an exciting discovery. Okay, and you don't tend to make errors that lead you towards an unexciting discovery. It never works that way. It's always the other way. Errors always lead to something big. And of course, something big then gets into the news. Ants can predict earthquakes. That's pretty big news. You may design your study poorly. You may just, and often it's just for practical reasons, usually money. It, for example, costs a lot of money to follow a lot of patients to find out whether a certain drug helps them or not. The more patients you have, the more money it takes. You need nurses and doctors to evaluate the patients. You need to usually pay the patients to take these studies. It costs a lot of money, and usually there isn't that much money. And there's simple things like this, no blinding. That means that you haven't made yourself unaware of the particular situation that's going on in the study so that you don't put your biases into it. So again, science can be pretty fragile, and all of these things all go in one direction. They all go towards producing extravagant claims rather than producing nice, solid science. Problems with the claims. So this is a good way to test if what you're hearing is nonsense. Is what they're saying just way too precise? There's no way that they could know this. If I go back to the COVID was created in the lab conspiracy theory, there's basically no way you, as just an individual walking down the street, can know this. You would either have to find some sort of, genetic signature of something being created in a lab, and I don't even know if that's possible or not, or something else, if I have a spy in the lab. But you, as a person walking down the street, have no idea about any of this. And, if your friend, if your aunt tells you that COVID was created in a lab, they're making an unreasonably accurate claim. They just have no way for knowing. Criticism is met with excuses. This is another one too that I see a lot, that, someone claims they've invented an anti-gravity machine and you say, yeah, but what about this? I tried it out and it didn't work. Oh, you didn't do it right. This happens a lot, actually. A famous case from 30 years ago was people invented something called cold fusion, which is a way to make basically unlimited energy just on a tabletop. And people, this was huge news, and people around the world tried to replicate the studies, and none of them did it. And the original could do it. The original guys kept saying, well, you didn't prepare your sample properly. Oh, you didn't, the temperature was too cold. Your electrical equipment was faulty, and all of this stuff. And it went on for several years before people finally gave up. Another example, another way to recognize pseudoscience is that you have to invent incredible theories to explain the thing that you see. So, you could claim something and claim that maybe aliens are, making it happen, or that the laws of gravity don't apply inside of your little beaker or something like that. Something incredible has to be created to explain your claim that's outside of normal science. So that's an example of something else you can recognize. I want to finish with this thought. I should have started with this, but I want to finish with it. Why should you care? Why should you pay attention to anything that I'm telling you? This is why. Every day you'll be faced with making decisions that affect your life and those around you, your family, for instance. And what do you base those decisions on? Well, we've already talked about the things that influence what you believe and how you make your decisions. Your social network, your family, your education, your religion, your friends, your politics. And you have to be aware of that. And the real issue here is that if you're basing decisions on falsehood, it's disempowering. You're taking away part of your power if you're making decisions based on falsehoods. And what you'd like to do is make your decisions based to the best of your ability on things that are actually true, so that you improve your situation. You improve your situation for yourself and for your family. Okay, so that was the presentation. Thank you for tuning in. I'll send it back and we can take questions. I'll stop sharing my screen here.
That sounds great. Thank you, Dr. Swanson, for a wonderful presentation that really helped us identify how to evaluate information. I know that some of our attendees may not have many years of experience in college, where, a lot of times in the field of science, your professors will teach you how to identify pseudoscience or not. So if they are reading what they may consider a reputable news source, such as their hometown newspaper, participants may not be aware that sometimes journalists don't even have a say on the headline for their article. Many newspapers today are actually paying people to just write headlines, not even sometimes in their own town, right? They're in other states, just so that you can get clicks and you can gain revenue in advertising. So that's one thing for people to keep in mind. But how do they how would they identify the veracity of a story in their daily newspaper if they may not, if the article does not include sample size or doesn't necessarily include a reference to a peer-reviewed journal?
Yeah, thanks. Actually, let me follow up on something you were mentioning. So today, things are even worse than they used to be because we have the internet and constant sources of information flowing to us through our cell phones. And, much of that just could be wrong. And in fact, much of it is wrong that's flowing to us through that. In the old days, newspapers were very respectable, staid things. And that was the only way that people got information other than chatting with their neighbors. And journalists would check their information and make sure it was okay. And as you mentioned, the whole way that journalism happens these days is different. A lot of stuff is just published verbatim from a press release. So anybody can make a press release, and any agency, any website can just pick it up, put a headline on it, and there it is. There's your press release out in the world. And no one phoned to make sure that it was true or to check this claim versus that claim. None of that stuff necessarily happens. Often it does happen, but often it doesn't happen as well. So if you're, reading your local paper or, the online version of your local paper, more likely, and you come across some claim, like, let's say, I see stuff so often, eating turnips helps fight cancer, something like that. How do you assess this? Should you go out and buy, 100 pounds of turnips and start eating turnips? Convince your parents and your aunts and cousins and uncles and cousins to all eat turnips or not. So one of the things that really helps, if it's a good article, is that it'll actually have a link to the actual research itself. So that's one thing I look for is there a link to the actual original research? Because what the researchers, and I'm interested in this because what the researchers say can sometimes be different and sometimes a lot different from what the journalists say, how the journalists portray it. So you can just click through and then see the actual article. Now, it's going to be a science article, right? It's going to be 20 pages long. I don't want to read that. I'm not even going to understand it. But all of these articles have an abstract, a little paragraph at the beginning that give you a summary of what happened, what they're claiming. And that is written in a way to be understandable by most people. So you can read the abstract, that's what I do. And you can try to, first of all, you learn what they're actually saying. And secondly, you can get an idea of how good their study is. So they'll typically tell you how many people they looked at in their turnip study. And they'll typically tell you how confident they are in the results of their turnip study. They'll typically tell you all in the abstract whether the study was blinded or not, whether they were not aware whether the subject was eating turnips or not eating turnips in assessing, say, their health or something like that. So in just a few minutes, if they give you the link, you can get a much better feel for how reliable the thing is. Now, I hate to say the other way to do this stuff is kind of experience. So I've been around a long time and I can just sort of sense when this sounds like nonsense. I don't know who this person is. They seem to be saying something that I've never heard before. Surely if this was true, I would have heard it before. Turnips are really good. Surely, but I would have known that already. The person who did it comes from some institution I never heard of. It's some of my bias coming in now, but it's a little bit of a sign that, maybe I shouldn't trust this person. Or maybe there is no paper. Maybe they're just making the claim straight to the website. Then I get really suspicious. So there are all these little tells. It's sort of like playing poker. There are all these little tells that give you a sign of whether something is reliable or not. And it's kind of up to us as, adults in society to constantly be aware of that, because you just don't want to accept everything that gets thrown at you. You'd be spinning in circles if we just, salt is good for you, salt is bad for you, eggs are good for you, eggs are bad for you. You wouldn't even know what to do. You have to assess and make decisions.
That's a really good point. And I think it's also important to take into consideration that you have to be equally as careful looking into information when you may be using it as a reference in the future for one of your papers or to build on a theory. You think of physics and everything like that. So if there's faults with a study, or if it has correct information, then you may accidentally be building on a theory that is incorrect as well. So the
That's right.
information that you're learning today has a lot of implications for everyone.
Yeah, it's true for science, you're right, but I'm more concerned about sort of medical kind of things where,
Yep.
you know, I know people who refuse to eat certain things because they think it's bad for them. And it's just like, well, why did you make that decision? What are you basing that on? Their doctor didn't tell them, they just decided. And that's not necessarily, that could hurt you, right? That could
Right.
literally hurt you.
And using your earlier example of turnips, sometimes too, it's also important to take a look at the source of who funded, for example, the study. So it could be that the Turnip Association funded the study.
You're making a joke, but it's true. This stuff
No,
happens all the
completely.
time. Drug companies fund their drug studies. Oil companies fund oil, climate studies. There are lots of people with agendas out there. And if you can also, by clicking, find out where this thing was funded from, they'll typically thank at the end of the article, scroll down to the end, they'll typically thank their funding sources. And that's also a clue. So, yeah.
It is. It can be definitely a red flag. I mean, that we saw that happen with the smoking industry and so many other examples. So yes, I was using the Turnip Association as a joke, but I really did mean it seriously, because
There are a
it
lot
has
of angry
happened.
turnip farmers out there right now. So you
Right.
better watch out. You're going to get sued.
We do have a question that says, how can we know if it is pseudoscience or some kind of prohibited investigation that was intercepted and revealed to the public? So it sounds like this might be more of a whistleblowing case, perhaps.
Well, I'm confused by this. Can you read it again?
Yes, it says, how can we know if it is pseudoscience or some kind of prohibited investigation that was intercepted and revealed to the public? So I think this person may be referring to perhaps with like some of the government research that whistleblowers reveal without really having permission to reveal details yet, because they feel that it's in the interest of the public.
Right. I guess this is a pretty specialized scenario. I'm trying to think of examples, maybe not so much research, but revelations about government spying, for instance, have happened with these whistleblowers. And sure, it's hard to assess because when it's one person making a claim, it is especially hard to assess. Is the person crazy? Do they have an agenda? Are they being paid, or are they legitimately trying to help society? And that is a tough judgment call. You basically have to take everything that you know to try to assess this. Is the person, are they actually an expert in the thing that they're talking about? Or is it just someone random from the street? Are they risking their own safety to tell us this stuff? Could they be thrown in jail for telling us this stuff? Is it plausible what they're saying? I mean, first of all, does it violate the laws of physics? In the case of, spying, it doesn't. Is it plausible that what they're claiming is happening? So those, again, are the sort of tells that you can use to help assess whether something's going on. To give an example in the other direction, there could be a guy on TV saying that the earth is flat, and there's actually, tens of thousands of people who honestly believe that the earth is flat. And you have to ask yourself, okay, look, how do I assess this? In my experience, does the earth seem flat? Oh, kind of, but if I look far enough away, it looks kind of curved. And I've seen pictures of the earth, and this guy, he's a retired, truck driver or something. He's not an expert in geology or atmospheric sciences or planetary sciences. He's something else. So you have to ask yourself these questions and make an assessment. Do the best you can to make an assessment.
Thank you for that. The other question is, I was wondering what you knew about the current talk about a room temperature superconductor. It doesn't seem likely to me, but maybe you know more details as a real scientist.
Yeah, that's interesting. There are so much of this stuff. I actually don't have time to dig into all of it. Some of it I do. There's something in nature which is one of the world's premier science magazines. And it was just like an obviously wrong statement. And, you know, I want to write a letter to Nature and complain about this obviously wrong statement that's appearing in their famous magazine. This one I have seen on Twitter, seen the claims. I have not read the original paper. However, there are lots of warning signs. So, and, you know, you don't always have to be, you know, Mr. Strict and Mrs. Strict and go and examine these things. You could just say, look, I don't know what's going on. I'll withhold judgment. That's a perfectly fine attitude to take. And, you know, we'll wait and see. Nothing wrong with saying that. That's basically where I am with this. Is I've seen it before. That's one thing. People have made these claims before. Number two, it's gone out into the media immediately. Number three, this scientist has made claims before that turned out to be wrong. Number four, it's very splashy and big. It's one of the big things that people want to find. And it's easy to fool yourself into thinking that you've seen something. Even if you're, you know, not out to fool people or anything, you can still fool yourself very easily. There are many, many examples of scientists fooling themselves. I can give you examples. So my bottom line on this is that the warning signs are there, and I will bet $100 it's not true, but in my most kindest moment, I'll say I'll wait and see with that.
That's very fair. And it actually works very nicely with our next question, which is how can we help other people in this case? And what they mean is sometimes they do not have that when they speak with others who may not have a degree, it's difficult for them to understand perhaps the science that this person is studying, and they feel that they make them uncomfortable. So in this case of discussion, you just found a really graceful way of saying, I mean, again, none of us really know what can happen in the end, right? It doesn't seem plausible with how we know science today, but you still said, well, let's wait and see, right? And so how can we help other people better understand pseudoscience? Yeah,
that is a very good question. And I've actually been struggling with it for more than 20 years. It is very, if your aunt comes to you and says that don't, and you're a young adult, you're just got married, you have a 1-year-old child, and your aunt comes to you and says, don't give your child the MMR vaccine because it'll cause autism. Now, how do you respond to that? Maybe you believe it as well, and you're like, no, of course not, I won't do it. Or maybe you don't, and you shouldn't, by the way. The whole story started with fraudulent, openly fraudulent science. This whole idea that MMR vaccine is dangerous was openly fraudulent. The man ended up in jail who claimed this. Well, he should be in jail. How do you respond to this then? You would like your child to have the MMR vaccine. You believe that it helps keep them healthy. How do you respond to your aunt? It is not easy. You can't just, what I've found and research indicates is that you can't just give them the scientific case. It's not enough because their belief is embedded basically in themselves, in their own self-identity. All of their friends believe this. Their pastor tells them this. Their news network they listen to tells them this. Their Facebook feed tells them this. Everything is tied up together, and it's extremely hard to break a thought like this. Now, if they're wavering, if they're kind of worried about it, you can give them the scientific argument, and often that'll shift their opinion. But if they're not, if they believe it's true, it's nearly impossible to change someone's opinion. The best approach that I understand to try to change someone's opinion is a very slow and steady one. So slowness, unfortunately, is part of the process. What you have to do is work at them for a long time. You have to get them to question why they believe what they believe. You know, how are you so sure? Where did you get your information from? Your aunt. Your aunt told you that. So this is your aunt's aunt. Sorry, I chose that example twice. You know, where did she get her information from? How sure are they? And you have to build on that, chip away over many, many months, and maybe you'll get somewhere. It can be very hard to convince people to change their minds, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. That is a tough one. And that example you provided is a real one that pops up over and over again in families.
Yes.
This next attendee says that this is one of the most anticipated talks in REYES. So they've been looking forward to today's talk with you.
Thank
They've
you.
been really interested in the social aspect of science for a while, and they're interested in knowing your opinion in two things. The first is they feel that social media has become a ground for breeding misinformation and disinformation, and they would like to know, how can we deal with this issue, which can be fatal?
Yeah, good questions again. You've made me think back to the beginnings. I remember when I was a postdoc, actually, someone said, "Hey, Eric, look at this," and it was the internet. But it was so early in the days of the internet that it was text-based. So all you had was words on the screen, and some words you were underlined, and you could click on them, and then more words on the screen would pop up. And I went, that's cool, and walked out of his office. I was too stupid to realize what an important thing this was. The next year, another friend came by and said, "Hey, Eric, look at this." And this time they had developed a browser to actually look at the internet with pictures. And he pulled up an image of a hurricane barreling down on Florida. And I looked at this and I went, wow, that is something. And I remember those early days, people were very starry-eyed about the internet in the early days. They thought that this would be the way that people can communicate truth to each other, which in retrospect was very naive. It is a way to communicate, but it doesn't have to be truth. It can be anything. And I would be actually very interested if there's research on just how many true things versus untrue things there are on the internet, just the whole internet. It's not going to be 90-10. It's probably going to be like 50-50. So unfortunately, it's become a way to transmit both truth and misinformation. Now I ranted so long that I forgot the main question. What was it again?
Just this idea that social media has become a ground for breeding misinformation and disinformation, and how can we deal with this issue, which can be fatal?
Yeah. Again, it's very hard. You can do your bit, though. I actually think it's important that people do their bit. So when someone you know, especially says something that you just find obviously wrong, you can do two things, right? You can ignore it, or you can say something. You can make a comment saying, you should know that, a lot of people don't think this is true. You could be very mild and just say, this isn't necessarily true, or you can get into an online debate. Now, I've done that before, and online debating, you never change the person's mind, but other people who read it will at least know that whatever the claim is not believed by everybody. So I think you can do your bit, and that helps. There are other more direct things you can do, and there are actually efforts to do this. So Wikipedia is a prime source of information around the world. I use it all the time. I even used it, don't tell anybody this, but I even used it for background research for a paper I wrote. It's not bad. But there are false statements on Wikipedia. And if you're reading Wikipedia and you see something that is dodgy or looks like it's got an agenda or is just out in left field, you can submit an edit. You can edit it yourself, or you can just put in a comment on the Wikipedia page saying, how do they know this? Prove it, or something like that. And that makes a difference. That is actually a sort of an important thing that you can do. There is also an effort to write new Wikipedia pages. So for example, minorities and women are underrepresented on Wikipedia, and people want to correct that. So you can not just edit a Wikipedia page, you can make an entire Wikipedia page. Say there's some famous person from, wherever you grew up who did some scientific thing and doesn't have a Wikipedia page. You can go and make a Wikipedia page. It doesn't have to be fancy. You can start it off and do that. So there are things like that you can do. There are also more reliable sources out there. So there's something called the Cochrane summaries, which is an attempt to aggregate information on medical studies. And if your aunt makes claims about turnips to you, you can send her to the website for Cochrane studies, and she can type in turnips, and up will come, if you're lucky, a statement from a mainstream medical establishment. I mean, doctors are doing these, looking at the studies and making recommendations, and they will tell you whether turnips do this or that or not. So there are certain sort of gold-plated places you can go on the internet that'll help you fight against this misinformation. I'm sorry, there's no great answer, right? It's a process, and it's sort of a battle.
Mhm. And it sounds like there's a lot of aunts out there that we have to educate as well.
My aunt is a great person. I shouldn't pick on her. She's fine.
And then the second part of the question from this individual is, today most people don't have the patience to seek out correct information and read it themselves due to how social media is functioning, and people have much lower attention spans today. So this is a large problem, especially that science is usually published in papers and few of it is presented in a short video format. That's a really good point. So what are do you have any opinions or any thoughts on that?
No, again, another great question. By the way, when I think about the first talk I gave and this one, I got really good questions. So, congratulations to all of you out there. Really deep questions. It is a problem. Absorbing information is a problem, especially because the way it's supposed to be presented, if you're doing mainstream science, is in an article that goes into a journal, and it can be very technical. I get science magazines. I get a few of them. I get, every week I get a couple of them, and I leaf through it, and my eyes just glaze over. I have no idea what they're talking about. Cis, alphine, alpha transcriptase, hepto, homoglite, just word salad. But as I mentioned before, the abstract tends to be more understandable. If you're lucky, there are news reports that summarize scientific findings. So these science magazines, they have websites. They will have, one paragraph summary of the big things that happened this month. Those are the things you want to find and read. I'm trying to think of other sources that are like that. I'm hesitant to say you can go to YouTube because there's a lot of garbage on YouTube, but there is a lot of gold on YouTube too. And if you can find someone who's not, pushing the idea that, space lasers are going to shoot us down and that airplanes are spreading chemicals everywhere, well, beyond, pollution, then it can be very good. And there are good people on YouTube who you can just subscribe to, and you'll see what's going on. I can think of a few examples. Physics Girl is one. She's very good. Unfortunately, she's ill right now from COVID, but she's very good. She knows her stuff. Just subscribe to Physics Girl on YouTube. I'm trying to think of the names of other ones.
We have Andrew Dotson, who actually is one of our speakers. He also has a great following on physics on YouTube. He's
okay. Yeah, there are, dozens and dozens of these people who are reputable and do a good job of explaining things. So unfortunately, it's not easy, but you can find sources and get good summaries that are understandable of what's going on out there.
And perhaps this would even inspire some of our attendees today to create their own channels and have this opportunity, right, of solving a problem which they identified, which is that oftentimes the latest in research is not presented in a short video format. So perhaps they can take initiative too in presenting this and help share information, right?
Great idea, and especially important in other languages too. I would love to see that this happens in other languages, not just in English or
Absolutely.
French.
I'm sorry about that. We just have one more, we have time for just one more question. And that is, this person says, thanks for the presentation. Do you know if there are books or courses that would help them improve their communication skills to do a better job communicating science?
Okay, right. So science communication is finally rising up in the consciousness of the scientific establishment, and people are getting more worried about it. So they just recently, they're starting to have conferences on science communication. I don't know of any specific books about this. Oh, actually, is there a way we can get information to people? Can I send you some links and things
Absolutely,
like that?
yes.
And then you
I
can
would be happy
send
to
out?
email the group. Yep.
Okay, I will put together a little list of things. I know of a few books. I actually have a book, which I'm not going to flog to you because that'll be a sign of pseudoscience. But if you want to Google me, it has 2 chapters in it about communicating and about detecting pseudoscience. There is the American Physical Society now has an effort in science communication, and they run online courses in doing science communication. I'll try to find the link for that too, because that's a free way to get involved with this and try to learn how to do this stuff.
What a great question. And thank you for those resources. Yes, I would be happy to forward the information to the REYES participants.
Okay,
Well, thank you again, Dr. Swenson, for joining us for a second time. You certainly gave us a lot of food for thought for the future, and hopefully the ideas that you identified in the best practices will help everyone identify what may be fake science versus true science. So thank you again for your time. On
Very
behalf
welcome.
of REYES, we really appreciate what you've done today, and we look forward to seeing everybody for the rest of the week. So thanks again.
okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.